Beijing's first permanent naval facility outside Chinese territory opened in 2017. Not on the Pacific Rim, not in the South China Sea, in Djibouti. At the western mouth of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the choke point that connects the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, the second approach to Hormuz. The base holds provisions for resupply, a pier long enough for destroyers, and helicopter facilities. China called it a logistics support base, not a military installation. The distinction is diplomatic, not operational.
And the location tells you everything about what China's actually worried about. Djibouti doesn't protect Chinese territory. It doesn't project power into the Pacific. It sits on the supply line, the line that runs from the Persian Gulf through the Gulf of Oman, down the East African coast or across the Indian Ocean to the factories of Guangdong and the refineries of Shandong. That's what the base is for, keeping the oil moving.
China imports roughly 11 million barrels of crude oil per day, more than any other nation on Earth. And approximately 40% of that volume, around 4.5 million barrels daily, transits the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Oman, the suppliers are Gulf states. The route is the same route it has been since the first tanker sailed out of Abadan in 1912, south through the Gulf, through the 6-mile channel, into the Gulf of Oman, east. The direction has changed, the dependency hasn't.
And nobody connects these two things, but China's exposure to Hormuz right now is structurally identical to Britain's exposure in 1914. A rising industrial power, an economy that cannot function without a fuel source it doesn't control, a supply line that passes through a choke point governed by someone else's geography. Churchill looked at that equation and bought 51% of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The question is what China's version of that purchase looks like.
The parallel is precise and it is uncomfortable. Britain in 1914 consumed far less oil than China does today. The quantities are incomparable, but the structural vulnerability was the same. A single maritime corridor, no alternative route with meaningful capacity, and a political environment at the choke point that Britain could influence but never fully control. China's position is, in certain respects, worse. Britain at least held treaty relationships with every sheikdom along the Gulf's southern shore. It had the Royal Navy forward deployed. It administered Gulf affairs from its own colonial apparatus in Bombay. China has none of that. It has commercial relationships. It has arms sales. It has the Belt and Road Initiative, which has financed port infrastructure from Gwadar in Pakistan to Khalifa Port in Abu Dhabi. But it does not have a security architecture in the Gulf. It has never had one. And the security architecture that does exist, the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain, the carrier strike groups rotating through, was built to serve interests that do not necessarily align with Beijing's.
Which is exactly what's happening right now with the quiet diplomatic shift that most people haven't registered. In March 2023, China brokered a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two powers that define opposite sides of the Gulf's sectarian divide. That deal wasn't about ideology. It wasn't about Sunni-Shia reconciliation for its own sake. It was about the strait. Because the scenario that most threatens Chinese energy security is Iranian disruption of Hormuz triggered by a Saudi-Iranian confrontation. If you can keep Riyadh and Tehran talking, you reduce the probability of the one event your economy cannot absorb.
The diplomatic logic is sound, but it rests on a premise that every previous outside power has tested and found insufficient. That you can manage the bottleneck through relationships, through commercial entanglement, through the shared interest of all parties in keeping the oil flowing. The British believed the trucial system accomplished this. It held for 150 years, until it didn't. The Americans believed the twin pillar strategy accomplished this, arming Saudi Arabia and Iran as co-guarantors. It held for 8 years, until the pillar in Tehran collapsed and everything built on it fell.
And the pattern that keeps appearing is this. The outside power enters the Gulf believing it can structure the choke point problem away, build enough relationships, sell enough weapons, maintain enough presence, and for a while it works. The oil flows, the premiums stay low, the tankers transit unmolested. And then the internal politics of the Gulf shift in a direction the outside power didn't predict and can't control, because those politics are driven by local forces that don't care about the outside power's strategic framework.
Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy maintains an estimated 1,500 fast attack craft, small boats, fiberglass hulls, some armed with machine guns, others with rocket launchers or anti-ship missiles. They operate from bases on the Iranian mainland and from the islands Iran seized in 1971, Abu Musa and the Tons, sitting directly in the shipping lanes. The doctrine is specific. In a confrontation, these boats do not engage a carrier strike group in open water. They swarm, dozens of boats converging simultaneously from multiple directions on a single vessel transiting the narrow channel. The target doesn't have to be military. A supertanker loaded with 2 million barrels of crude moving at 14 knots through a 6-mile corridor with no room to maneuver, that's the target. You don't need to sink it. You need to damage it enough that it blocks the channel, or that Lloyd's in London recategorizes the strait.
And the insurance piece is the mechanism that most analysts miss. A mine in the shipping lane doesn't have to hit anything. It has to be confirmed. One confirmed mine, just one, and the underwriting committees in London convene. War risk premiums spike. If the threat is sustained, coverage gets pulled, and a supertanker without insurance doesn't sail. Period. The ship owner's bank won't allow it. The port won't receive it. The entire supply chain is built on a financial infrastructure that is exquisitely sensitive to risk signals from the strait. Iran doesn't need to close Hormuz with naval power. It needs to close Hormuz with actuarial tables.
In June 2019, 2 tankers, the Front Altair and the Kokuka Courageous, were damaged by limpet mines in the Gulf of Oman, just outside the strait. The United States attributed the attacks to Iran. Iran denied involvement. The evidence, video footage of an IRGC patrol boat removing an unexploded mine from one of the tanker's hulls, was contested in Tehran, but persuasive to most maritime analysts. The attacks didn't close the strait. They didn't even significantly reduce traffic. What they did was demonstrate capability, and they moved insurance premiums. War risk rates for Gulf transit spiked within several 100% within 48 hours. A vessel that had been paying $50,000 for a Gulf transit was suddenly facing quotes of $500,000.
And that's still true today, because the premium mechanism has never been diffused. Every time tension ratchets up, a drone is shot down, a tanker is seized, a nuclear negotiation collapses, the rates move. They move in London, they move in real time, and they ripple outward into the price of crude, the price of gasoline, the price of petrochemical feedstocks, the cost of shipping containers from Asia to Europe. The Strait's influence on the global economy isn't limited to the moment of crisis. It's priced in continuously. The threat is always live.
In January 2024, when Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping diverted hundreds of vessels from the Suez Canal, many of those ships rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 weeks and millions of dollars per voyage. The disruption was not at Hormuz. It was 1,000 miles west at a different choke point entirely. And yet, Hormuz traffic patterns shifted. Insurance rates for the entire Gulf corridor were reassessed because the choke points are not isolated. They are nodes in a single network. Instability at one radiates to others.
And think about what that means for a country that imports 4.5 million barrels a day through one of those nodes. China can't reroute around Hormuz. There is no Cape of Good Hope option for the strait. The oil is on one side, the refineries are on the other. The only sea passage is the 6-mile channel. China has been building a strategic petroleum reserve, reportedly approaching 1 billion barrels. But at 11 million barrels of daily imports, 1 billion barrels buys you roughly 90 days. After that, the factories go quiet.
The pipeline alternative that exists, the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline running from Abu Dhabi's interior to the Emirate of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman's coast, bypassing the strait entirely, can carry approximately 1.5 million barrels per day, against daily Hormuz flows of 20 million. It covers less than 8%. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline adds capacity, but it terminates at the Red Sea, and the Red Sea has its own choke point at Bab el-Mandeb, which is precisely where the Houthi disruptions occurred. There is no infrastructure solution that neutralizes the strait. Engineers have studied it for decades. The volumes are too large, the geography is too constrained. Pipelines can shave the margins, they cannot replace the corridor.
So China is doing what every previous power has done. It's building relationships with both sides. Arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the Iran-Saudi normalization deal, infrastructure investment across the Gulf, naval exercises with Iran, with Oman, with Pakistan, port access at Gwadar, 60 miles from the strait's exit. Not a permanent base, not yet, but a facility that exists and that could be expanded. And the modern version of this is not Churchill buying shares in an oil company. It's something more distributed, more commercial. Port equity instead of colonial concessions, diplomatic mediation instead of treaty enforcement. But the underlying geometry is identical. You need what's on the other side of the bottleneck. You can't get it any other way. So you build whatever structure you think will keep it flowing, and you bet with your entire industrial economy that the structure holds.
The Dillman merchants made the same bet 4,300 years ago. They used Indus Valley weights, not Mesopotamian ones, because the value of their position depended on what lay east of the strait. The copper, the lapis lazuli, the ivory came from the Indus. Dillman's wealth came from being the node between Mesopotamia and that eastern source. The weight system tells you where the gravitational pull was. It was east.
The Portuguese understood this. Albuquerque seized Hormuz not to control the Gulf for its own sake, but to control the spice route from India. The customs house on Hormuz Island taxed goods moving between the Gulf and the Indian subcontinent. The value was in the connection to the East.
The British understood this. The entire trucial architecture, every treaty, every political agent, every gunboat existed to protect the route to India. The Gulf mattered because India mattered. When Indian independence eliminated the strategic rationale, Britain left within 20 years.
And that's the thread from Dillman to Beijing that runs through every act of this story. The strait's value has always been determined by Eastern appetite, by what the civilizations east of the Gulf were consuming: copper for bronze weapons, horses for cavalry, spices for European tables transshipped through Indian ports, and now crude oil for the largest industrial economy the world has ever produced. 4,000 years and the gravitational pull hasn't reversed. It's intensified.
What has not changed, and what cannot change because it is lithospheric, is the constraint. The Arabian Plate is still moving, still pushing northeast into Eurasia at roughly 2 centimeters per year. The Zagros Mountains are still rising. The Musandam ophiolite is still rigid. The strait is still narrow. The deep water still runs close to the Iranian shore. The islands are still there. And Iran, however its government is constituted, whoever leads it, whatever its relationship with Washington or Beijing or Riyadh, sits on the northern coastline and holds those islands, and operates 1,500 fast attack craft, and possesses the ability to lay mines in the navigable channel within hours. Not because of ideology, because of where the deep water is.
The prisoner's dilemma at Hormuz has never been resolved. It's only been managed. Iran can threaten to close the strait, but Iran's own economy depends on the same 6 miles of water. 40% of Iran's government revenue comes from oil and gas exports that transit Hormuz. The jailer lives in the cell. And every outside power, Britain, the United States, now China, enters the Gulf believing it can manage the paradox: keep the oil flowing, keep Iran contained but not cornered, keep the insurance rate stable, keep the premiums low enough that tankers keep sailing. And for years, sometimes decades, it works. The system holds.
Until it doesn't. Because the trap that geology set is still sprung. The hydrocarbons are still pooled in the anticline folds on both sides of the Gulf. The bottleneck is still carved from the same collision that created those folds. The oil and the choke point remain products of a single event, inseparable, permanent, indifferent to whatever flag flies over the nearest carrier deck.
The Acadians sent ships through. The Portuguese sent cannon through. The British sent gunboats through. The Americans sent carrier groups through. The Chinese are sending tankers through. Each believed the passage could be secured. Each discovered that the strait collects a price from everyone who depends on it.
The question isn't whether the next crisis will come. The geology guarantees it. The question is whether the power that depends on the strait most, the one whose factories fall silent after 90 days, has read the history of every empire that squeezed through before it.
And whether they noticed that none of them held on.
Pulse Origins presents Strait of Hormuz, produced by Singularity Pulse Network. This series is for informational and educational purposes only. Historical accounts are sourced from published research, reporting, and public record. Some timelines are condensed for narrative clarity. Nothing in this series constitutes legal, financial, or technical advice. Views expressed are those of the hosts and do not represent the positions of any organization mentioned.
I'm Caden. The Pulse Brief is every weekday, 10 minutes. AI, space, crypto, cybersecurity, what matters most today? Find it wherever you listen.
I'm Knox. Every Saturday on Pulse Deep Dive, one story told in acts. This season, how AI happened, who really invented the internet, and going back to the moon 53 years later. New chapter every Saturday. Find it wherever you listen.